We are born into this time and must bravely follow the path to the destined end. There is no other way. Our duty is to hold on to the last position, without hope, without rescue, like that Roman soldier whose bones were found in front of a door in Pompeii, who during the eruption of Vesuvius died at his post because they forgot to relieve him. That is greatness. That is what it means to be a thoroughbred. The honorable end is the one thing that cannot be taken from a man. Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about Oswald Spengler's Man in Technics, and a sort of brief background on Oswald Spengler and his works. Spengler was a leading figure in what was called the German Conservative Revolution. This was probably the second largest right-wing movement in interwar Weimar Germany besides the National Socialists, and it made up thinkers such as Ernst Jünger, Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger, and of course Oswald Spengler. Now Spengler is a great student of Friedrich Nietzsche, incorporating his idea of will to power in a more organized and concise structure. He also is a major proponent of the sort of cyclical view of history, of the rise and fall of civilizations, and in his Magnus Opus, Decline of the West, he sort of theorizes how the West will fall, why it's going to fall, and through this, you can kind of look at the ebbs and flows, which are the rise and falls of many different civilizations, and sort of apply that to your thinking. So it's incredibly valuable. However, Decline of the West, which was written actually before World War I, but not published until afterwards, obviously due to the complications of the war, it's very complicated. It's very dense, and it's very long. It's like 500 pages, and I myself struggled a great deal trying to read it, and Man in Technics is a lot shorter. It's 78 pages, including the introduction, so it's very short, very concise, and very profound, and is full of great information, and I want to share some of that with you today to contribute to the sort of zeitgeist of our new dissident right, or whatever you want to call it. So I'm just going to jump right into it with the first chapter, which is Technics as the Tactics of Living. Now, he points out that the idealist movement of the 19th century is highly focused on cultural projects, that the leaders and the elite value cultural projects above all else. This is like arts, music, architecture, sculptures, whatever. They sort of begin to view technical processes such as war as barbaric. They view economics and engineering as unimportant. And it's quite interesting, and the way that I sort of interpret this is an almost bourgeois view of art, which I think is very incorrect. You take the Greeks, for example, and they had a very practical view of art. What people don't realize is when you see a Greek sculpture, this perfectly chiseled Greek statue, it's not just there to look pretty. Those muscles have a functional quality, and that functional quality is being skilled at battle, is being skilled at war. You'll notice that none of these Greek sculptures look like steroid bodybuilders. They're all lean and muscled, sort of like an athlete or like an MMA fighter or even a gymnast, because it is practical muscle that is utilized for warfare. The Greeks have this aesthetic ideal of beauty, which is something functional and practical. It is to win in war. In the same way that a lion is beautiful and strong and muscled, the way that a tiger is, it's because they are predators. They must be strong to capture their prey, and that is why they're beautiful. The aesthetic quality we attach to something is rooted in something that actually has objective value. In this case, and in the case of the predators, warfare, essentially. But the idealist movement and this sort of bourgeois view of art arises, and it's almost ascetic in a way, right? Because it sort of strays away from the elemental reality of life, which is that life is a great struggle. It is an arena of competing wills. And from there, you get a response, which is arguably liberalism and Marxism. So as the elites, right, the old aristocracy who used to be warriors, begin to get decadent, they begin to waste all this money extravagantly on these great projects, which are beautiful, but don't have a functional quality. That's where you get things like the French Revolution. People are starving. People are like, well, why do you have power? You're just using it on all these cultural projects, but you're not really powerful. And they were right to an extent, because the aristocracy was growing quite decadent. So from there, you have this very big backlash and this very big response, which is incredibly materialistic. And that's sort of the impetus of liberalism and Marxism, is that these are very materialistic ways of thinking. Liberalism is the idea that those who can gain capital, who can gain financial advantages, who can essentially make money, that making money and the skill to make money is what determines your value as a person, and hence what should determine your power. Like, if you work hard, if you're smarter, if you're more talented, then you will make more money. This is the view of liberalism. And of course, there are many issues, and I point out the issues of liberalism throughout my videos, but this is the point of view. They believe that a materialistic solution can solve the problem of, let's say, inequality, of the problem of, well, these elites are growing decadent. It's like, well, if we just figure out a good system, in this case, the system of exchanging money as a skill, of making money as a skill, then everything will be fine and the right people will be in charge. That's the liberal point of view. It's a material solution, right, to what I would consider a spiritual problem. And it's very similar with Marxism, except a different sort of method of attaining equality, or attaining a quote-unquote better hierarchy, is just the dissolution of the hierarchy. It's not like, okay, with liberals, it's like, well, we're just replacing essentially what was originally skill at war with skill at finance, skill at making money, skill at creating new industry and whatnot. But the Marxists say, no, we're just going to tear down hierarchy altogether. We're going to have, essentially unions where the workers control their own product. They earn what they produce, right? They keep what they produce, right? There's not really this overarching leader at the top who gets more profits than the worker. And, a lot of people think this makes sense, but again, the word impetus is going to come up a lot. The impetus to sort of be greater is absent when you are equally distributing the rewards, right, of the guy at the top and the follower, because the fundamental issue of Marxism is viewing all humans as equal. In fact, things like beauty, for example, stem from inequality. I think this is something that Spengler recognizes. So what Spengler is trying to point out, in my opinion, is that it is not the issue of the idealists being elites, right? It's not even the issue of how they got to be elites, but it's the issue of decadence, which comes from them forgetting about war, forgetting about industry as an important factor into projecting power and exerting power. You need industry. You need a good economy. You need good engineers. You need good architects. And you need great warriors. The problem is that the liberals and the Marxists, they forget about this sort of inequality that comes from warfare, that comes from higher types of humans, and they say, well, no, we're just going to throw all that aside. Economics for liberals, or let's say with the Marxists, this very humanist approach, like, let's make everyone equal. And of course, that's a gross oversimplification, but this isn't really the point of this thing. I'm just going to sort of brush over that for now to move on. But essentially what the liberals and especially the Marxists want to create is this utopia without war, crime, or disagreements between different human types. And they believe they could do that through a material ends. They believe if you have abundance for everybody, that it is only, someone having property, for example, or someone having more than others, that causes these discrepancies to arise, and that causes class conflict. And I think Julius Evola does a great job of discounting this in Ride the Tiger, where he talks about the fact that all the material conditions that Marxism seeks to establish for its average worker is actually accomplished in liberal capitalism. In the United States, for example, take a film like Grapes of Wrath, which was considered to be, a film about great poverty. It was a film, and originally a book, obviously, about a man in great poverty. And originally, the Soviet Union actually showed this film. It was the one American film they showed as propaganda to the Soviets, because, well, look how terrible their lives are. Look how terrible and evil capitalism is. But they actually took the movie away and censored it because people were starting to notice, hey, this American worker who's supposed to be like the poorest of the poor, he has a car. We don't have cars. So it's like and this is the Great Depression, obviously after World War II, things get a lot better in the United States and the quality of life is quite high for everybody at a certain extent, even the lowest of the low. So it's like the material conditions that Marxism seeks to provide for the worker is actually accomplished in a liberal capitalist system. So it's like, even from the perspective of, well, we're using the material to solve a problem, right? Well, the material solution of liberalism actually does more than the material solution of Marxism. But of course, we don't believe that a material solution can solve what we consider a spiritual problem. And it actually gets more into that later in the book. But essentially, in this first chapter, Spengler's talking about technics existent in all life, and technics being technique. And he talks about an animal, for example, and how all animals have some form of technique. They have this pre-coded instinct within them, which can be quite complex and quite amazing. Take the honeybee, for example, which can construct these great honeycombs. Like, it's very intricate and very organized and literally down to a T. Like, all these combs are like almost exactly the same dimensions. It's quite amazing. Or like a spider spooling a web, a perfect web. It looks like a work of art, but it's natural. It's just encoded in this spider or whatever, right? Like ants, they cooperate so efficiently. And that what distinguishes human techniques from the techniques of an animal is the awareness that we put into it, our conscious effort into wielding the tactics. Call that the will or the possession of the soul, versus animalistic instinct, which is a coded objective, right? That's sort of the difference between what we call AI today. Is really it's just a randomly generated from a series of responses, right? It doesn't really have a soul. It doesn't really have a will yet. Who knows, right? Maybe Skynet will happen. But there's a great quote that's sort of describing what I'm talking about. I'm going to read it to you. Technics is the tactics of all life. It is the inner form of the process utilized in that struggle, which is identical with life itself. That is the second error that has to be avoided here. Technics is not to be understood in terms of tools. What matters is not how one fashions things, but the process of using them, not the weapon, but the battle. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this quote. One of them is the idea of becoming versus become, the sort of Nietzschean eternal recurrence, constantly evolving, versus the Hegelian end, like the sort of progress of history towards the specific ends, become. And I think this is what distinguishes the spirit from the material. See, becoming is a spiritual journey. It's a spiritual process. So when we talk about, well, Marxism, liberalism, whatever, they're material solutions, but even in liberalism, which has a material solution, it doesn't solve the spiritual problem. And the spiritual problem is that inequality is inherent in society. And at the end of the day, we want to be greater, we want to be better. And there will always be inequality. The solution then becomes, well, how do you have the right inequality? How do you have an inequality that actually reflects human value rather than something arbitrary, like I think is the case in liberalism? I don't think that being able to make more money necessarily equates to higher quality person, right? And this is also the difference between the architect and the worker. So he's talking about the plan versus the tool, right? And I think he's sort of saying that the plan is superior. It is not the weapon that is superior, but the battle in which the weapon is being used. And that's the sort of differentiation between the architect or the worker. Or take the pilot and the plane, for example, the fighter pilot versus the person who creates the plane, right? And both are important, both are integral. But action is ultimately what is more valuable, and action is ultimately that realm that is almost spiritual. That's where artistry is created, right? It's like you don't celebrate the person who makes the brush or who gets the raw materials for the color or the canvas. It's the artist who creates something spiritual, right? It's crazy because you can have two exact sets of tools or two exact sets of painting, like material or whatever, and two different people. And if somebody can do a lot better job than the other person, that's almost a spiritual experience. The fact that they can put this painting together, construct it in a way that is superior to the other, that doesn't make any sense. They have the exact same, they're both humans, they have the exact same thing in front of them. But then that inequality I talked about, which is beautiful, the inequality of the greater painter compared to the lesser painter, shines through. And that's almost this sort of higher view of technics, the techniques that relies on planning and action and actual will of the person. And here's another quote. It was a little ridiculous, this march into the endless future, towards a goal which men did not seriously conceive or dare to visualize clearly. For by definition a goal is an end. No one does anything without thinking of the moment when he shall have attained that which he willed. No one starts a war, or goes to sea, or even takes a walk without thinking of its duration and its ending. Every truly creative human being knows and fears the emptiness that follows upon the fulfillment of a work. I think it goes back to becoming and become. And this is sort of the Schopenhauerian view of life called the will to life, which is essentially a more westernized version of samsara. And samsara is the Buddhist concept that we are stuck in this cycle of desiring something, getting that which we desire, and once we have it, we enjoy it for like a week, and then we want it again. Or not that, but like something else again. Like you get a new car and you drive it for the first week, it feels amazing, but then you start browsing through the internet for another car. Like, not that you're going to buy one soon, but you start wanting something else. Like, you're never going to be satiated by material solutions. And it's the same thing with work, I think, and that's what he's pointing out, is that, we have this goal, but it's not the goal that we really find joy in. It's the process of attaining that goal. And that's sort of the differentiation between different types of people, is like the really wise and enlightened and higher individual understands it is the process and that you must live for the process. Sam Sulek said, like, the man who enjoys walking will always beat the man who enjoys the destination. In the Hagakure, which is the sort of samurai Bible or samurai manual, samurai handbook, there's a quote along the lines of, you must seek perfection your whole life long, knowing you'll never attain it. It's the pursuit of perfection which is beautiful, not the actual final product, because we're never going to be perfect. No one is ever going to be perfect. We're never going to be fulfilled by the ends. We're never going to be fulfilled by the end of the work. It is the process of creating that work. It is the action of painting. It is the action of throwing fists during the fight. It is the action of lifting weights. That's what's beautiful. It's not the final product. Of course, that's beautiful, but it's like you attain that final product. That's not the end. What you're just going to do, die? Maybe. Good for you, Let's do a sort of Yukio Mishima. But no, it's like, until you die, I mean, that really is the end, is death, whatever you are before death. But until death, you are constantly a becoming, and maybe even after death, right? Like, you don't know what's going to happen after death. So it's like, we're constant becoming. It's about the journey, not the destination, as cliche as that sounds. That's essentially what he's saying in so many words. Another good quote, to development belongs fulfillment. Every development has a beginning, and every fulfillment is an end. To youth belongs age, to arising, passing, to life, death. For the animal, tied in the nature of its thinking to the present, death is known or scented as something in the future, something unthreatening. It only knows the fear of death in the moment of being killed. But man, whose thought is emancipated from the fetters of here and now, yesterday and tomorrow, boldly investigates the once of past and future, and so knows that death is coming. It depends on the depth of his nature and on his worldview as to whether he triumphs over this fear of the end or not. An ancient Greek legend, presupposed by the Iliad, tells how his mother put before Achilles the choice of whether he wanted a long life or a short life full of deeds and fame, and how he chose the second. And he brings up this story again at the very end, which it's actually, well, you'll get to it. But I think it's interesting. It's like, again, we're going to go back to Mishima on this, because it's very interesting. Man deals with the fear of death through an optimism of progress. It's about what can you do before death. You are spurred by the knowledge of death, knowing you have a limited amount of time to make an impact, an imprint on the world. That's sort of the will to power, because it's not just about survival. We're all going to die. It's not even just about reproduction. That might be the core sort of central will, right? Because from power, you can reproduce. But I think so much more comes out of that. And they're not abstractions, but enhancements, right? There's a difference between an enhancement of a certain will and an abstraction of the will. And I think it's an enhancement, this will to power. That's sort of what's maybe even supersedes and precedes reproduction, right? Maybe power is the original core thing, because it's like, well, take, for example, evolution. Why do we evolve? Why do we evolve if life is just about survival? If it was just about survival, then why not just be like a cockroach, right? And I say this a lot, the perfect animal for survival. They'll survive the nuclear holocaust, right? But humans don't. Humans have to deal with mental health, so many different variety of illnesses. We're not expendable. We take a long time to actually give birth to offspring. It's 9 months, right? It's not like a cockroach where it's like what, like a week maybe, 2 weeks, right? Or some animals where it's literally a day. We're not like that. It takes a long time. So it's like our life is more valuable, but it's also more vulnerable. So it's quite interesting that we evolve, and we evolve, I think, because of this will to power, or even a will to eternity, which I brought up before. Will to eternity is a will to power which solidifies humans as an eternal sort of being, right? That's why we reproduce. We reproduce because having children is like a sort of immortality. Your bloodline continuing past you is a sort of version of immortality. It's all very interesting stuff, but I don't want to harp on this too much. I want to move on a little bit. But like I said, Mishima comes into it because he contrasts the artist and the man of action together. Action is the temporary flower that blooms and dies in fall. It blooms in spring and dies in autumn. It's very short-lasting, but in that short-lasting period, it is very beautiful. If you look at the life of the warrior, for example, they live based on their action, and they might die because of their action, but in that short time, they feel an immense euphoria, which goes beyond sort of the lasting ascetic virtue. So you could live to like 110, being a monk and never having sex or never eating good food, and like they value their denial of life. But it's like, well, what have you really, all you've really done is lessen your ability to experience. See, when you expose yourself to pain, you increase your experience. It's like you make yourself bipolar. You could be really, really, ecstatic and have the highest of highs but the lowest of lows, like Caesar, for example, right? I always like to bring up Caesar riding a chariot through the streets of Rome with his face painted red to represent the cult of Jupiter. That was the greatest moment of his life. Nothing could top that. That was just pure, immense ecstasy and power and wonder and grandeur. But to get there, he went through a lot of hardship. He was captured by pirates. He was ousted from Rome for a long time because I believe his family was like on the wrong side of some disagreement. It might have actually had to do with Sulla. Don't quote me on that. But he went through immense hardship to get there. Alexander the Great fought alongside his men. He broke many bones. He had many near-death experiences. It's like great blooming of action, right? It takes a lot of risk and a lot of danger, and it happens in a very short amount of time. But in that short amount of time, the deeds that you gather and the acclaim is what matters, right? Doing great things within that short amount of time, that's the man of action. The artist attempts to stretch out their grandeur over a long period of time, even after their life. And there's still beauty to this, no doubt. But it's a fear of death for both men. But one man deals with the fear of death. The man of action deals with the fear of death by confronting death head on, by seeking death head on and fighting death. While the artist, right, almost like an ascetic, tries to stretch it out, right? So the man of action increases his chance of dying painfully, but also his chance of living grandly. Whereas the artist, is like maybe here, right? Like you can still attain a lot from art, but if you create art hoping to do something, like for it to, maybe your art, for example, becomes famous after your death, you don't feel the highest of highs that the warrior does. And the warrior is also remembered after death. Like more people know who Alexander the Great is than even somebody like Vincent van Gogh, who is a great artist, perhaps the greatest artist of all time, and a very great individual and somebody that I admire. He turned his madness into beauty, but people still remember Alexander the Great, despite the fact that I don't believe Alexander the Great wrote any books. I don't believe he had any of his own works to continue. It was only his action. His action was immortalized in the works of others. That's how great he was, right? So it's quite interesting. So that's something to think about. And there's some other things that Spengler talks about. He also talks about the fact that we don't really choose our destiny beforehand. We're sort of thrusted into certain positions in life, sometimes lower, sometimes higher. And it's about what we do with that position. Again, it sort of goes back into what he's discerning between the tool versus the overall techniques, the planning that goes into it. It's about the will to use the tool, the will which uses the tool as an instrument of power rather than the tool. For example, Napoleon is born into a relatively low station. Toyotomi Hideyoshi is born into a low station. Even Magnus Pompey came from the plebeian class. Or Julius Caesar, even though he was a patrician, he came from a very illustrious line. They were in a very low point when he had his rise. He had to really work hard to get to where he was because they were bankrupt and they were in a very bad position. So it's about the will, right? The stronger will which utilizes techniques to their advantage, right? That's true techniques, is the will which goes along using the tool. So the quote is, "It is not within our power to choose whether we would like to be sons of Egyptian peasant of 3000 BC or a Persian king or a present-day tramp. The destiny is something to which we have to adapt ourselves. It condemns us to certain situations, views, and actions. There are no men in themselves, such as the philosophers prattle about, but only men of a time, of a locality, of a race, of a personality type, who contend in battle with a given world and win through or fail, while the universe around them moves slowly on, with a godlike unconcern. This battle is life, and life in the true Nietzschean sense of a cruel, pitiless, relentless battle deriving from the will to power." And this sort of describes what I'm saying, right? It's like, you're not born great. You might be born into a better situation than other people. And somebody like Alexander the Great is born in the perfect situation and he meets his potential. He lives up to this potential. That was like literally the topic of my first video, which was pretty horrible in hindsight because I really didn't know anything and I had terrible production quality, but check it out to see my progress over time. But it's like some people are born into those good situations and they have the will to capitalize on the talent, because talent is a combination of your born abilities and also the situation you're born into. Alexander was born into literally the perfect situation, right? And I don't want to prattle about this. Go to my first video to sort of learn more about that. But it's like there are many people who sort of transcend very terrible odds, and this is something that I like about the sort of men of destiny, and I think Spengler is one of them. It's like Evola talks about how the Roman conception of victory, the Roman believes that they can alter fate, whereas the Greek sees it more as a sort of uncontrollable phenomena. The Roman believes they can influence fate, that they can determine their fate through action. And I love that so much. Man is the master of his own fate. Man is the master of his destiny. It doesn't matter where you're born. And sometimes it clearly does matter. If you're born a cripple, you're going to be highly disadvantaged. You're never going to be a conqueror, most likely. You know, Ivar the Boneless in real life was not a cripple. He just couldn't get it up. So there's obviously limitations, but for the most part, there's so much that you can overcome, right? And there's so much that you can transcend. Your birth does not necessarily determine the outcome of your life. So chapter 2, herbivores and beasts of prey. And I sort of alluded to this in my video, Nature is War. And it's sort of differentiating the predator and the prey. And it's quite interesting. And he starts off the chapter by saying man is a beast of prey, meaning we are predators. And there's a hierarchy of life. He first points out plants, which are alive, but are completely dictated by their environment. They can't move, they have no will really, and even if they had a will, they couldn't act on it because they're sedentary, they can't move. So a plant can be eaten alive and there's nothing they can really do about it, right? Even the plants that defend themselves, like a cactus, they can't move, right? Like a Venus flytrap, I guess, chomps on things, but if he's getting eaten from the bottom, there's nothing you can do about it, right? So plants are at the very bottom because they lack a will. They lack an attacking spirit or even a defending spirit. They're just there. Now, prey are second. They eat living things, plants, who cannot fight back, but they also have a will, which is, their will is, to eat plants, but also to defend, also to run away, to escape, because they have to deal with predators, which goes into predators, which are at the top of the hierarchy. So prey defend. Plants neither can defend themselves nor attack, while prey can only defend themselves and cannot attack. They do not seek out. They wait to be confronted. And this was what puts predators at the top. Their will is highest above all other animals because their will is relatively uncontested. If you're an apex predator and nothing can defeat you, nothing can hunt you, then you dictate everything that happens in your environment pretty much. So that puts you at the top. It's a hierarchy of wills. Whoever can exert their will most at the very top, and whoever has the least amount of will at the bottom. And I think this applies with people as well. And that's sort of the spiritual problem. It's like, well, how do you regiment society in a way that this hierarchy does reflect that sort of naturalness, right? That realness, that real who has the strongest will and who is the strongest can exert their influence the most and who has the least ability to do so. So here's a good quote. The animal of prey is the highest form of mobile life. It implies a maximum of freedom from others and for oneself, of self-responsibility, of independence, and an extreme of necessity, where that self can hold its own only by fighting and winning and destroying. It imparts a high dignity to man, as a type, that he is a beast of prey. And this is essentially what I'm saying. And, to go off of this, I love this chapter in Ernst Jünger's The Worker, der Arbeiter, I think is how you say it. And he talks about liberal war. And I think what Jünger says about liberal war is very similar to the herbivores or prey. See, the herbivore or prey animal can only defend. And granted, they will defend themselves. If a bull is attacked by a lion, it will fight back, and it might even kill that lion in self-defense. And the way that liberal war works, as Jünger describes in The Worker, is that it must only be defensive. It must only be justified morally. It cannot be the seeking of conflict or the seeking of offensive operations. And a lot of times it is, but it can never be seen that way publicly. And part of this is because in a liberal society, they're led by merchants, not the military. So because the merchants are not doing the fighting, like the political class are essentially merchants, they are not the military class. Because they're not fighting, they can't convince other people to fight purely for the gain of the merchants who aren't fighting the wars themselves. So they have to convince the lower classes who become the military class, but a subdued military class and not warriors, just soldiers. They have to convince them that, no, this is unavoidable. We're only defending ourselves. Or, no, this is unavoidable. These people are under tyranny. We have to free them, right? They have to have a moral justification because they themselves aren't fighting. So to convince people through propaganda, they have to make war seem unavoidable. And the same with herbivores or prey animals as well. They have to defend themselves, right? That's the only time they'll generally seek combat. And this isn't always true. Obviously, there are prey animals that fight against each other, for example, right? They'll even fight predators for water, for example. If there's a watering hole and there's not enough water, sometimes they get desperate. But for the most part, they only fight defensively. And here's another great quote, and I'm going to continue reading a lot of good quotes. Cleverness in the human sense, active cleverness, belongs only to beasts of prey. Herbivores are by comparison stupid, and not merely the innocent dove and the elephant, but even the noblest sorts, like the bull, the horse, and the deer. Only in blind rage or sexual excitement are these capable of fighting. Otherwise, they will allow themselves to be tamed, and a child can lead them. And I think it's interesting because I sort of mentioned that, right? Like sometimes they will seek to fight, but generally they do not. And to go off of this, there's something very interesting that Spengler talks about that I also discussed in my video Nature is War. And he says the senses of the predator, this is how I paraphrase it. The senses of the predator seek, right? The prey defend. The predator's eyes are fixed forward. Our eyes are fixed forward, and they're fixed forward so we can direct our destiny, right? We're directing where we look. We seek out life, and essentially we're seeking out things to attack life, even in our daily lives. If you're just trying to find your keys, for example, it's attacking life. You got to find your keys so you can get your keys, so you can get in your car, you can drive to work. And when you're driving, you got to find out how to get to work, right? You got to look at the path. You are constantly attacking. You are constantly moving forward. You are directing your destiny. Whereas the prey is sideways. The prey's eyes are sideways, waiting for predators, waiting. They do not seek their destiny. It must come to them. They don't have control or will that dictates their life. It simply comes upon them. And that's the distinction between the predator type and the prey type, right? And it also goes into the sort of idea of the communal herd of the prey versus the solitary hunter or the smaller band of predators, right? And it's interesting because this also goes into the distinction between sedentary agricultural societies, which are often matriarchal, as Carroll Quigley points out in Evolution of Civilizations, and the sort of hunter-gatherer type, which he also describes as being patriarchal and warlike. And the communal herd depend upon having a large group to defend themselves, whereas the smaller band of hunters have quality. They have a higher quality, right? They're a higher quality being, they're a higher quality life, so they don't need as much. They don't need the herd to defend themselves. They just need a small group of highly qualified, highly skilled killers, or even one if you're like a tiger or something, right? Plenty of animals hunt alone. Tigers, leopards, I believe, jaguars, right? The domestic house cat, right? So, and that's not to say that somehow makes them superior, but I think the smaller band or the solitary hunter is superior to the sort of communal herd because it's like a higher quality of the individual. Because if you had 100 cows, that might be equal to like 10 lions. I'm just throwing out random numbers, but clearly the 100 lions is superior to the 100 cows, right? So it's like they're clearly superior and there is an inequality there. And here's a good quote by Spengler again, and this refers to the idea of property. And he says, property is the domain in which one exercises unlimited power, the power that one has gained in combat, defended against one's peers, victoriously upheld. It is not a right to mere possession, but the sovereign right to do as one wills with one's own. And I think it's interesting because it goes into this idea of the communal herd, where the communal herd, or the agricultural matriarchal longhouse society, as like Bap talks about, is very communal. Things are shared because nobody really has a strong will of their own. They're very collective, right? And that's not to say the small band of hunters aren't collective, but they're collective as individuals. It's like how I distinguished Rome, right? Rome was collectivist, but not in a way that the Marxists are collectivists. They were collectivists in the sense that you fight for the glory of Rome, but you do so as exceptional individualism. Your individualism was how great can you contribute to the collective. I think that's the difference between the sort of warlike peoples and the peaceful peoples, the matriarchal longhouse societies, is like their collectivism came out of an overall mediocrity, of overall weakness. They were all weak. They didn't need property because they didn't feel the will or the strength to exert ownership over property. So this is like why I hate Marxism so much, is it's like an evening of the playing field. It's like you are so weak and so pathetic that you have to tear everyone else down to your level because you cannot actively seek out and take and defend your own property. So this is the distinguishment between the hunter and the prey. And this kind of goes into something else that Spengler talks about, and I think Bap talks about this to an extent as well. It's like nothing changes for the herbivore or prey in captivity. He's probably more content, right? Because in captivity, the herbivore or prey animal has everything they need. They have food, they have shelter, they don't have any threat by predators. They don't lose anything by being in captivity. In fact, they gain something because all they care about is life, and they gain a better life in captivity. But the predator, on the other hand, is stripped of his independence and power, especially an apex predator that has no natural predators, that is the king of his domain. He loses independence and he loses power. I think Bap says, like, the noblest of animals do not mate in captivity, right? And something that Nietzsche talks about in, I believe, Twilight of the Idols is that there's an idea of noble death. The noble will either be victorious or die free. They would rather die as a free man than live as a slave. There's a quality of life that they feel entitled to because of their higher being, right? The higher being of the lion, the higher being of the noble person. They would rather die having that at the last moment of their breath, or their last breath, the last moment of their life, than be subjected to somebody else's will. I think that's quite a beautiful thought. And of course, like I've discussed before, sometimes you have to wait it out. Sometimes you have to pull a Count of Monte Cristo and be a slave for a bit, but eventually get your revenge and be free once more. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution, but I do think there's a beauty to ritual death, like dying rather than living as a slave, right? And something to consider about the nobility of the predator versus the sort of the lesser being, which is the prey animal or the herbivore, right? Like, they can be domesticated, they can be easily turned into a slave. And it's like the great person cannot be turned into a slave. And something that I think is interesting is that Native Americans, for example, were, and I'm talking specifically in America and Canada, so the ones who lived in the plains and whatnot, were a lot harder to subdue than a lot of other groups because they weren't communal, because they lived in these smaller bands. They had this idea of freedom and nobility. So when they tried to turn them into slaves, they often died in captivity because the Native American culture was quite noble. It was a very noble culture, and it is very sad to see what has happened to them. But of course, that such is war, right? Like, that's what happens. If you lose, you lose, and conquest is a noble thing as well. But what I'm trying to point out is people will die sometimes rather than live as slaves. Many Japanese soldiers, like, you would have like 90%, I believe, of Iwo Jima died fighting or committed suicide rather than be captured. So there is a beauty to it, even if, like I said, it's not a one-size-fits all. And it's quite interesting, right? People like the Japanese or the Native Americans would rather die than be slaves a lot of the times, right? So it's quite interesting. And like I said, I'm not trying to demonize the Americans in either case because, like I said, conquest is noble. If you lose, you lose, and you deserve to lose. And that's just life. If you are weaker, then you lose. But I can still respect my enemy. And in the case that, they would be my opposition as an American, I can respect them still. Like, I respect, the Vietnamese, for example, who fought off the Americans. Even like the Taliban, you have to admit they're brave, even if I completely disagree with their sort of radical views on religion, right? But I can respect the warrior who, it's like there's a Soviet saying where it's like, how can you defeat the Taliban, or it's not the Taliban yet, it's just the Mujahideen at the time, but like, how can you defeat the Mujah when he sees paradise in the barrel of a rifle? Like, it's such a great quote, and these are such brave, extraordinary people, like the Taliban and the Vietnamese, and whatever enemy that America has faced, I can respect a good adversary. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I respect courage and I respect warlike tenacity, even if I despise that culture. I can always respect a great warrior. So moving on to another quote. Such is the difference between the destiny of herbivores and that of the beast of prey. The one destiny only menaces, the other contributes something as well. The former depresses, makes mean and cowardly, while the latter elevates through power and victory, pride and hate. The former is a destiny that is imposed on one. The latter is a destiny that is identical with oneself. And the fight of nature within against nature without is thus seen to be not misery, as Schopenhauer and as Darwin's struggle for life regard it, but a grand meaning that ennobles life, the amor fati of Nietzsche. And it is this kind that man belongs. And it's so great. I love this quote so much because it's sort of capturing what I'm saying. the idea of your destiny. Like if you are the predator, you seek your destiny. If you are the prey, your destiny comes to you. You don't have control over it. The true noble man seeks his destiny. You seek pain. You seek death straight out. That's why I said the man of action is superior to the man who is ascetic or an artist, like a pure artist. Like I believe true artistry has to be tied to action. This is a Mishima sort of view, and it's a Greek aesthetic view, right? Like the Greek aesthetics is functionality in warfare. It's practicality. It's an objective quality to beauty. That's what's most beautiful. And it's so beautiful and so interesting. It's like we seek out our destiny as humans. We seek it out. We are predators. And the highest humans within our species seeks out. We seek to conquer. We seek to dominate life. And that's such a beautiful thing, exertion of will over the world around you. And, I brought up Hobbes and Rousseau during my Nature is War video, and the sort of difference, I think, is that Rousseau views humans almost like herbivores. He almost views us as this animal that lets destiny come to us. We're amicable, we're friendly. In the state of nature, we don't go to war. It's this sort of cringe view that I think is almost adopted by Marxists, right? Whereas Hobbes says, no, in the state of nature, we're constantly at war. Man is warlike, and that's a good thing. It's good to be warlike, because that's just what we are, and you should embrace what you are and turn it to your advantage. For example, if we're not at war, maybe use that to go to the moon, right? The Cold War was a war where it was unconventional. We were fighting proxy wars and whatnot. So it's like, well, how do we win that war? We're going to go to the moon. We're going to bankrupt you over time, right? So anyway, but yeah, like man is naturally warlike, and I think that's a good thing. Like we seek out our destiny. That's what war is, seeking out your destiny, being offensive, conquering those who wait for their destiny to come to them. And I think that's what's lost in a lot of media today and a lot of movies is like you have this hero who is forced to be the hero. I hate that so much. You shouldn't be forced to be the hero. You should be like Achilles, where you seek your destiny. You seek to be the hero. You confront life head on. You say, I know I will die before I'm 30, but I'm going to seek life nonetheless. I'm going to seek the short and beautiful and great life above the long and drawn out one. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. And one more quote from this chapter is, the tactics of his living are those of a splendid beast of prey, brave, crafty, and cruel. He lives by attacking and killing and destroying. He wills and has willed ever since he has existed to be master. And that's what true human life is about. It's about exerting your will. It's about being the best, being the greatest, being the most powerful. And it's such a beautiful thing. And that's why Technics is integral to this. The sort of bourgeois view, which the idealists start to adopt, is like, oh, well, great music and all this stuff, that's what we need. We need more paintings. We need more architecture. But the Greeks understood that these things weren't good in and of themselves. There's this like Platonist view or a sort of Kantian view, like a thing is either good or bad. No, that's not what it's about. It's like, well, architecture should be the physical manifestation of the will to power. Great art, great body, a beautiful body is like, well, this is a functional body. I'm going to use it to defeat my enemies. It shouldn't just be, well, I want a good body, right? There has to be a reason for it, and that reason is rooted in power. And that's what the Greeks understood, and that's what the idealists didn't recognize. You need technics. The Greeks understood that. You need technics. You need to exert your power. That's what art should be for, and I actually talk about this a little bit later. And number 3 is the origin of man, hand and tool. And it's essentially Spengler talking about how the hand is so integral to our intelligence. The hand allows man to invent and manifest his vision and will in ways that animals cannot. Even like a raccoon is quite intelligent, and I think a lot of it has to do with the sort of the neurons or whatever that have to go off when you're using your fingers. Like that takes a lot of thinking and a lot of nerve endings and whatnot. And I think that's part of why there's clever little fuckers, or like why we evolved the way we did, like primates with hands. It allows us to build tools. It allows us to move things, right? It's such a valuable tool. Or even an elephant with his trunk, right? It functions similarly. And there's also, like I mentioned earlier, the distinction between creating and using a tool. I talked about the pilot versus the person who builds the plane, right? And sort of the importance of being the architect or the person that actually benefits from the tool. Because like this allows man freedom to form his own instruments, to form instruments that basically allow him to exert his will to power better. It's like you don't just take what's given to you. So for example, even though primates can sort of use tools, very primitive tools, like maybe a rock and a stick, it's sort of pre-made, right? They can't really construct tools. But by constructing tools, we can tune it to our environment, for example. So If you wanted to build a boat, for example, you could build a boat because you were by the sea. If you're maybe in the plains, right, or the steppe, you build a chariot because, okay, well, it's like I'm in the plains, I need a chariot, right, to go defeat my enemies. It's like you can form tools the way that you want to fit your specific will, and that's such a beautiful thing and such a great thing, right? And that's what is freedom for us, is like our minds aren't confined by our bodies. Our bodies can allow us to maximize the potential of our minds. Is that not Faustian? Is that not Promethean? We have Promethean fire in our body and in our minds, and it oozes in our blood. It's such a beautiful thing, and such an amazing thing, really. And I really love it so much. Like, I just love this sort of, you are the master of your destiny. You have it within you. That's like such a great and beautiful thing. And another quote, the act of the thinking hand we call a deed. There is already activity in the existence of the animals, but deeds begin only with man. Nothing is more enlightening in this connection than the story of fire. Man sees, cause and effect, how a fire starts, and also do many of the beasts, but man alone, end and means, thinks out of a process for starting it. No other act so impresses us with the sense of creation as this one. It is the deed of Prometheus, one of the most uncanny, violent, enigmatic phenomena of nature. Lightning, forest fire, volcano, is henceforth called into life by man himself, against nature. What it must have been to man's soul, that first sight of fire evoked by himself. And that's what I'm talking about. It's like we literally are creating these tools to expand the limits of our will to power, to be limitless, our will to eternity. We literally are confined by nothing, right? It's like what we can think we can eventually create, and that's what's so beautiful about living in this era. And a lot of people blackpill being in modernity, but though things are bad, we also have greater potential than we ever had before to do so much more. Elon Musk is literally trying to get us to colonize Mars. We have so much power at our disposal. We need only use it correctly. And more quotes. Under the tremendous impression of this free and concise individual act, which thus emerges from the uniformity of the impulsive and collective activity of the genus, the genuine human soul now develops into a very solitary being, even as compared with those of the other beasts of prey, with the proud and pensive look of one knowing his own destiny, with an unrestrained sense of power. And the fist habituated to deeds, a foe to everyone, killing, hating, resolved to conquer or die. This soul is profounder and more passionate than that of any animal whatsoever. It stands irreconcilable opposition to the whole world, from which its own creativeness has separated it. It is the soul of a rebel. And he in Decline of the West, he thanks Nietzsche and Goethe for his writing prose, and it's so amazing because he does have some very beautiful moments of writing, and you see it shine in Man and Technics because it's less dense and it's shorter, so you can really enjoy it more. You can take your time with it, and I really love what he says here, and it's so beautiful, and it's essentially what I'm describing with you right now, right? It's like we have a will to domination, and in that will to domination, of that will to inequality, to create inequality between us and other people, that's where beauty comes from. That's what beauty is born out of, and it's a beautiful thing. And he talks about the noble soul confined in civilization, surrounded by artificiality that strays from nature, and this is very reminiscent of what I think it's reminiscent of what Bapp calls controlled space in Bronze Age mindset. So Bapp talks about the young masculine figure who doesn't feel accurately represented because he thinks that the jocks, right, like the football types, are inauthentic. It's like not a real display of manhood. I mean, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I think people that play football, it's great, right? It's very cool. But it isn't the most authentic. I think fighting is the closest you can get in modernity to something real, something less controlled, and it still controls space. Of course, I'm biased because I did wrestling and mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu all throughout high school, and still now, of course, I'm recovering from my neck injury. But after I get back from that, get back into it. But it's like that's like the closest you can get to uncontrolled space, combat, right? MMA, very close, but even there, it's controlled space. So it's like. I think it's sort of how I felt, right? Like I would see people who I consider jocks, and it's like, well, something felt wrong about it, artificial. It didn't quite feel right. It was a simulation and abstraction of warfare, but not warfare itself. And the closest I could get to that was MMA. And I think that MMA pretty much gave me what I wanted, but like I've never been in combat, right? I've been in areas close to combat, but I've never actually been in combat, and not even close to any like really big combat, like close to like terrorist activities, right? Like terrorist campaigns when I was in the Philippines, and when I was close to that, but I wasn't really in it, like when I was on my Coast Guard deployment, we were being tailed by Chinese ships, right? And obviously we both had big guns and whatever, but I'm not really I'm not in war, right? So I'm still missing a perspective, right? But I'd say generally MMA has sort of given me what I sought, right? That authenticity. But even still, it's controlled space. It's not completely authentic, right? So the noble feels confined in civilization because you have controlled space all around you. You're stripped of the frontier, right? A lot of people in our sphere talk about the frontier, that uncontrolled space that exists, that doesn't have law, and that it is completely dependent on your will to power to be able to dominate and to be able to have something of value within that space, right? Through warfare. And it's interesting. And I think in a lot of ways, art is an attempt to retain the spirit of nature through a form regulated from raw action because you are constrained by society. So we talk about Greek art, for example, how it represents something very functional, reminiscent of warfare, right? Like the aesthetic body, sculptures, which represent the aesthetic body, these great architectural feats, paintings even of warriors, or like the Homeric epics. It's all for a purpose, right? It's to make you stronger and to make you a better warrior and a better thinker and a better individual with high thumos, and pursuing Andrea, which is manliness, pursuing arete, which is excellence, right? Like they all have a function, is what I think I'm trying to say. And I think art attempts to be that bridge between nature and civilization. It's like art should be used to retain the spirit of nature, to make us virile and to keep us strong, and to demand of us the savage excellence which exists in nature. So that's interesting. I'm going to go to chapter 4, which is the second stage, speech and enterprise. And it's essentially talking about language as a tool of planning, right? The hand allows for creation, but that creation takes time. It takes processes, it takes steps, and you can't do it alone. You need multiple people to do that. You need the architect and the worker, the laborer, right? And therefore, you require time and the cooperation of different wills working together, and that requires language. And he talks about how romantics view speech as preeminently perfected and reduced to simpler forms through history, while in reality, it does begin very primitive, grunts, hand signs, whatever, and from there it develops, and it develops not because of, necessarily because of art or whatever. I mean, over time, yeah, it can, but fundamentally it develops because of enterprise. And what enterprise is essentially this long-term production using technics, right? Man's greater ambition and ambitions and visions require this enterprise of collective effort to realize them. The architect needs enterprise, which is working with the workers and laborers to actually build this great monument or whatever, right? And part of it includes the domestication of animals and breeding specific animals to fit specific roles. And of course, this regimentation of different things applies to humans as well. You have specific people who are good at making nails, for example, like blacksmiths, or you have people that are people who make stonemasons, right? And just the average laborer. You need all these people with very specific roles to fit this collective vision. I think that's what separates the noble aristocratic man from the sort of person lower on the hierarchy, is that the noble man has this grand vision. They aren't really specialized, right? They're specialized at war, but war isn't like a trade, right? It's a way of life. And what separates him is that you have many people who are good at one individual thing, and that still exists today. It's like you have a computer programmer, that's essentially a trade, right? And the tradesman is lower for most of human history. And it's not to say he's not important, but the person with a grander vision of what he needs the tradesman to create, that's the person who is noble. That's the person who is higher and aristocratic. And here's another quote. For in this age of verbally managed enterprises, there are not only two sorts of technics. These, by the way, diverging more and more definitely as the centuries go on, but also two kinds of men differentiated by the fact of their talent lying in one or in the other direction. As in every process, there is a technique of direction and a technique of execution. So, equally, self-evidently, there are men whose nature is to command and men whose nature is to obey, subjects and objects of the political or economic process in question. Such is the complicated mode of human life that has existed since this historical shift, and which has assumed so many forms, and it could only be done away with at the expense of human life itself. And like I said, we can't just have a bunch of workers and laborers, and we can't just have a bunch of people at the top who give orders. You need a combination of the two, right? And this isn't always a very peaceful thing that comes about. Like you said, it's very complicated, and sometimes death is involved, sometimes warfare is involved, the differentiation of people, right? Natural inequality, which sort of leads to the different segments of human society, and higher and lower. So it's quite interesting, but you need both, right? Technics requires the leader and the follower. And that's something I've said so many times, right? You have the architect and you have the worker. You have the architect, which has the vision and goal, and you have the worker, which helps realize it through the actual physical work. But I will say, I think that everyone should have some sort of elemental connection to the work, right? This is something I think Jung sort of talks about in The Worker, and something I talked about in one of my last videos on Mishima, where I was talking about, power at a certain extent. Somebody has to wield power to some degree. Somebody has to do the killing no matter what in any society. So it's like everyone should be antiquated to a certain degree with the elemental. So I think even the architect should know something of the work that the laborer does, right? It just makes him a better leader overall, and it creates harmony. It's like the man that leads from the front, like Marius would dig trenches with his legionaries, right? Alexander would fight alongside his men and be bruised and scarred and whatnot. I believe Julius Caesar ate the same rations as his men. It's like you have all these people, and it's like when you suffer with your men, you suffer with the sort of the ground troops or the workers, they will respect you more. And that's a fundamental aspect of leadership. So another quote, out of the combats of individual carnivores, there has sprung war, as an enterprise of tribe against tribe, with leaders and followers, with organized marches, invasions, and battles. Out of the annihilation of the conquered springs the law that is imposed on the defeated. Human law is ever a law of the stronger, to which the weaker must conform. And this law, considered as something enduring between tribes, is peace. Such a peace also prevails within the tribe, so that its forces may be available for external action. The state is the internal order of a people for its external purpose. The state is as form, as possibility, what the history of a people is as actuality. But history, of old as well as today, is the history of war. Politics is only a temporary substitute for war that uses more intellectual weapons, and the menfolk of a community who are originally synonymous with its army. The character of this free beast of the prey passes over, in its essential features, from the individual to the organized people, the animal with one soul and many hands. The techniques of government, war, and diplomacy all have this same root and have in all ages a profound interrelationship with each other. So it's interesting, right? The predator, in this case, or the warriors of a society, become the state. And I think that's what you have to recognize, is we are a collective group. We are a state. The issue isn't like this sort of petty bourgeois view of freedom, like, oh, everyone pursues their own happiness. I hate that so much. It's very petty materialism. It's like, no, we are collectivists. We are a state, but we're not Marxist, right? We have certain people that are higher in society because of their abilities, their greatness. The warriors, for example, should be at the top of society because they are the ones actually exercising the instruments of power of a society, of a civilization. And I think what he's describing here is like the state is the manifestation of the entire people, right? What differentiates a state from another state is how powerful it is, whether it can exert its power on another or not. That's literally what dictates quality, and I talked about that in my Mishima debate with Hayden, right? That was my position that I was taking. And, he talks about politics as only a temporary substitute for war, right, which uses intellectual weapons. Again, watch my debate with Hayden for its, I believe it was called like Mishima and Will to Power on Sun and Steel. And I talk about this, like politics is not an accurate representation of conflict because it's like it's just a different way of waging war, but an inauthentic way where you have to simulate or approximate and estimate the value of each side. You have to estimate who's more powerful, and then you compromise based on that. Whereas war, it's just like, all right, let's see who's more powerful, and you fight it out, right? With a lot less variation and a lot more accurate assessment of who is more powerful. So, essentially what I'm saying is the warlike leaders are absorbed into the organ, right? Both themselves and their subjects. So in a sense, they lose freedom, right? Because they become a part of the collective. They're not just the tiger, the lone solitary hunter. And they're not even the person in the small band where they have more autonomy, where they know everybody, autonomy, and they know everybody in the band, right? Like they have less freedom now. They are beholden to the will of the collective. But at a certain extent, you want, as a warrior elite, for the state to reflect you. The state should always reflect its elite. And obviously, the elite are terrible today, and they are terrible in most of the world. But in a perfect world, the state should reflect the elite, which is a noble warrior elite, which are higher people than the rest. They are the overmen of society. That's how it should be. Another quote, "But even this lordship of the few is far removed from the ancient freedom. Witness Frederick the Great saying, 'I am the first servant of my state.' Hence the desperate efforts of the exceptional man to keep himself inwardly free. Here and only here begins the individualism that is a reaction against the psychology of the mass. It is the last spring of the carnivore soul against its captivity behind the bars of culture. The last attempt to shake off the spiritual and intellectual limitations that are produced by and represented by the fact of large numbers. Hence arise the types of life typified by the conqueror, the adventurer, the hermit, and even certain types of criminals and bohemians. The wish for escape from absorption by the masses takes various forms: lordship over it, flight from it, contempt for it. The idea of personality, in its dark beginnings, is a protest against humanity in the mass, and the tension between these grows and grows to its tragic finale." So I think that the way that you solve this is, as a leader, you must free yourself by using society as a means of pursuing your greater visions. So what you have to do, I think, as a leader is you have to make the society almost a reflection of yourself. If you have this great will, like say you're Elon Musk and you want to colonize Mars, you have to be a slave to your people to an extent, and you serve them so that you can colonize Mars, so that you can make all your ambitions come true. It's a symbiotic relationship. You break your back to give them a good life, but it's not like you're just giving them prosperity. It's not like you're just giving them like economic, well-being and comfort. No, you're giving them a higher life too. You're giving them better education, not because of some bullshit Marxist egalitarian view of human equality. It's like, no, if I have more educated people, we're going to be stronger. We're going to get to Mars quicker. That's why you do things. Like, there's no such thing as this sort of altruistic view. It's like life is will to power, but you can use that will to power to help people. But you don't do it out of pity or empathy. You do it because you want everyone to be greater. Because if everyone's greater, you will become greater too. You have to become greater if everyone's greater, right? And society will be greater if everyone's greater. That's why. And I think that's essentially how you free yourself, by making your servitude to the people how you attain your vision. Hate, the most genuine of all race feelings in the beast of prey, presupposes respect for the adversary. A certain recognition of like spiritual rank is inherent in it. Beings that stand lower, one despises. Beings that themselves stand low are envious. All primitive folktales, god myths, and hero sagas are full of such motives. The eagle hates only his peers, envies none, despises many, and indeed all. Contempt looks downwards from the heights, envy peers upwards from below, and these two are the world historical feelings of mankind, organized in state and classes, whose forcibly peaceful specimens helplessly rattle the bars of the cage in which they are confined together. From this fact and its consequences, nothing can liberate them. So it was, and so it will be, or nothing at all will be. It has a significance, this fact of respect and contempt. To alter it is impossible. The destiny of man is pursuing its course and must accomplish itself. And to sort of simplify this, it's very reminiscent of Nietzsche's master and slave morality. And essentially, just to simplify it, the master has his values first, selects his values first, which are strength, power, vitality, excellence, beauty, and selects his selects his opponents in opposition to that. So, for example, the slave is his enemy because the slave does not reflect those values. In fact, like Spengler's sort of pointing out, the slave isn't even really the enemy of the master. The master doesn't really see them as an enemy, it just sees them as this lower being that doesn't even need to be regarded, right? It's like you despise them, you don't hate them, right? It's like your true enemies are the other masters, and you want to be the greatest master, so you want to fight against other masters, you want to contend to other masters. Nietzsche in Ecce Homo talks about how he selects Christianity as what he wants to combat because he believed Christianity was the strongest essentially the strongest doctrine of the time. And he says, I never had a bad experience with Christians. I've always had good experiences with Christians. I have many Christians who are friends. And it's precisely because of that he felt that was the doctrine to attack. He didn't attack it out of hate, but out of like, well, this is another school of thought I respect. He actually did respect Christianity, is what people don't realize, but also incorrect to say that he supported Christianity, because he did not. So I'm sorry, Jordan Peterson. Lay off the benzos, right? But so the slave, on the other hand, selects their values based on the values of their opposition. So whatever the opposite values of their opposition are, that's their values. So for example, because the master pursues strength, power, beauty, excellence and whatnot, the slave is the opposite. They seek weakness and ugliness. They seek to tear down the master to their level because of envy, resentment. They feel that they cannot be as great as the master. They feel they're incapable of it. So instead of trying to be capable, they tear them down to their level, right? That's the psychology of the slave, and sort of what Spengler's talking about right now. It's like the only enemy of the master truly are other masters. The enemy of the slave is everybody, is the masters, and the other masters of other groups too. And that's what's interesting that differentiates the two. And then here we are, I believe this is the last chapter, chapter 5, the last act, rise and end of the machine culture. Here's a quote. There arises society with its hierarchy of classes, noble, priest, and bourgeois, as an artificial gradation of life against the background of mere peasantry. For the natural divisions are those of the strong and weak, clever and stupid, and as the seat of a cultural evolution that is wholly intellectualized. And that's sort of my issue with the sort of merchant bourgeois elite of today, as I think is an abstraction of nature. It is not the correct view of who is strong. They are strong in comparison to the proletariat, but they're not really strong. They don't actually wield the instruments of power. The warrior does, the military class does, the true military elite. So that's why I think it's an abstraction of nature. It's artificial, right? The northern countryside, by the severity of the conditions of life in it, the cold, the continuous privation, has forged hard races, with intellects sharpened to the keenest and the cold fires of an unrestrained passion for fighting, risking, thrusting forward, that which elsewhere I have called the pathos of the third dimension. There are, once more, true beasts of prey, whose inner forces struggle fruitlessly to break the superiority of thought, of organized artificial living, over the blood, to turn these into their servants, to elevate the destiny of the free personality to being the very meaning of the world, a will to power which lasts at all bounds of time and space, which indeed regards infinity as its specific target, subjects whole continents to itself, eventually embraces the world in the network of its forms of communication and intercourse, and transforms it by the force of its practical energy and the gigantic power of its technical processes. So he's basically talking about the West and how the West saw no limits. When you think about Columbus looking across the sea, he saw endless sea, endless oceans. If you look at the settler in early America, they saw endless forest, and lumber was highly sought after in Europe because they cut down all their forests. So it was very lucrative, the lumber trade in North America, or even go way earlier, right? You think about the steppe tribesman who just sees open plains. I must conquer the plains. I must go across the plains and find new lands to conquer, right? It's this Faustian spirit of constantly expanding, of no limits, right? Infinity. I can go on forever. When we look at space, that is the Faustian ambition. We must go and conquer space next. Another quote. At the beginning of every high culture, the two primary orders, nobility and priesthood, the beginnings of society, take shape clear of the peasant life of the open land. They are the embodiment of ideas, and moreover, mutually exclusive ideas. The noble warrior and adventurer lives in the world of facts, the priest, scholar, and philosopher in his world of truths. The one is or suffers a destiny, the other thinks in causality. The former make intellectual the servant of a strong living, the latter would subject his living to the service of the intellect, and nowhere has this opposition taken more irreconcilable forms than in the Faustian culture, in which the proud blood of the beast of prey revolts for the last time against the tyranny of pure thought. I think this is a big disagreement that Hayden and I had in my Mishima Sun and Steel debate, is like the warrior, the adventurer, the noble lives a sort of almost empirical existence. And I used to be more of a rationalist when I liked Plato, and I still find value in Plato, but I'm not a Platonist anymore by any regard. I'm very Nietzschean now. I think the idea behind like the sort of Nietzschean philosophy is understanding the elemental relationship with life and power. Is you need power to do anything. Philosophy means nothing without power. It means nothing without the manifestation of your ideals, which only happens if you have power. You need power. And it's like the Greek aesthetic. I say it again and again. The Greek aesthetic of beauty is tied to how that beauty can make you more powerful, how it can make you more skilled at warfare. And this is exactly what he's talking about, which distinguishes, for example, the original Greek, which is tragic and Homeric, compared to the sort of post-Socratic Platonist Greek, which believes you can, come up with objective truth and morality through rational thought, which is just not the case. Ultimately, what dictates morality, even objective morality, is power. Power is the one thing, and from there everything else sprouts. And like people that understand it and get it know that to be fact, right? And I think that's, he hits the nail on the head, right? And that's kind of what I'm describing here. This is kind of my interpretation, some more stuff he mentioned. Force is what drives. Like mass is a composition of energy. Force is what moves everything forward, and that's kind of what I'm talking about with like power. Power is force is power, right? God is the infinite force. God is the universe, if you look at the sort of pantheistic Spinoza's point of view, I guess. Like, I need to read Spinoza. I'm just paraphrasing what I know about him. But essentially, mastery of nature is to increase one's own power. This is Faustian, right? The Faustian ideal is using nature to your advantage. It's like, if you watch my video Radical Aesthetics, I talk about magic. Like magic is like technology. Technology is like magic, right? It's bending nature to your will. The artist who creates great art and great painting is bending nature to his will to something greater than the sum of its parts. That's Radical Aesthetics, and this is, my invention, Radical Aesthetics. But I do believe that, right? Like mastery of nature is used to increase your own power. The Faustian ideal is using nature, mastering nature, and that's essentially what magic is, and that's essentially what I think gives rise to the metaphysics over time. Metaphysics is a result of material processes and the technical processes, and that's what I love about Spengler so much, is I think he sort of gets it, right? And his philosophy can easily be applied to an almost futurist spiritual view of things, and I think it's quite interesting, right? And another quote, "The last idea never thereafter let go its hold on us. For success would mean the final victory over God or nature. Ducive natura." I don't know if that's correct. "In a small world of one's own creation, moving like the great world, in virtue of its own forces and obeying the hand of man alone. To build a world oneself, to be oneself God. That is the Faustian inventor's dream, and from it has sprung all our designing and redesigning of machines to approximate as nearly as possible to the unattainable limit of perpetual motion. The concept of booty, of the beast of prey, is thought out to its logical end. Not this or that bit of the world, as when Prometheus stole fire, but the world itself, complete with its secret of force, is dragged away as spoil, to be built into our culture. But he who is not himself possessed by this will to power over all nature would necessarily feel all this as devilish, and in fact men have always perceived and feared machines as the invention of the devil, when Roger Bacon begins the long line of scientists who suffer as magicians and heretics." Is what I'm kind of talking about. I think a big fear of like Christians, for example, or ascetics, people that fear technology, a lot of it is rooted in a spiritual view of what makes someone human. And I think it's the wrong thing. It's like we're constantly evolving, and if we're constantly evolving, technology could be used to help us evolve. And we can't let it be our ruin. We can't let technology take us over, right, and replace humanity. But if we can use it to enhance our humanity and to evolve to like the Overman, to the Nietzschean Overman, I think we absolutely have to embrace it, and that's why I'm a futurist, right? And yeah, I think like the whole deal with radical aesthetics is to experience theosis yourself. It's to be like Romulus, to become a god, like Aeneas to become a god. Julius Caesar became a god. Augustus Caesar became a god. That was the Roman ideal, and I think that's something that I think man should seek. Man should seek to use technology to his advantage as theosis, to propel him to a higher evolution, right? And I don't think that necessarily has to be in contention with Christianity or in contention with Buddhism or in contention with all these different beliefs. You can see Christianity and Buddhism as interpretations of this ideal of theosis, and it's just like they're just specific interpretations and they get things wrong here and there, but it's like I don't think you have to throw them out. I think they have to evolve into a new religion, a futurist religion. But it's like, I guess what I'm saying is, even like I think in radical aesthetics I talked about the second coming of Christ, like that can easily represent technological singularity, because the second coming of Christ sort of being the end of time. I don't believe it's an end of time. I believe it's the beginning of exponential growth, which feels like an end, because infinity is its own entity, but infinity is not just like a stagnant, static number. It's constantly going upwards. So it's like, it's an end maybe in the way we experience things almost, right? But it's not an end. Nothing ever really ends, so to speak, in my opinion, right? It's like time's a flat circle. I'm like Russ Cole in True Detective. But another quote, and this is going a little longer than I expected, but we are just about done, so bear with me. With the growth of towns, technics became bourgeois. The successor of those Gothic monks was the cultured lay inventor, the expert priest of the machine. Finally, with the coming of rationalism, the belief in technics almost becomes a materialistic religion. Technics is eternal and immortal like God the Father. It delivers mankind like God the Son. And it illumines us like God the Holy Ghost. And its worshipper is the progress Philistine of the modern age, which runs from La Mettrie to Lenin. All great discoveries and inventions spring from the delight of strong men in victory. They are expressions of personality and not of the utilitarian thinking of the masses, who are merely spectators of the event, but must take its consequences, whatever they may be. I think it's interesting, him talking about technics being bourgeois, and it's sort of this liberal and Marxist view that technics is purely a material thing, right? It's a material solution to whatever problem society has, where it's like you have to spiritualize technics. You have to spiritualize it. You have to almost really make a religion out of it. He says it's sort of treated like a religion, but it has to become the religion. It has to become the magic of your religion. It has to become an instrument of your religion. Futurism can't just be a secular movement. It has to become something. It has to synchronize into something greater, into an actual metaphysical doctrine. That's my belief. And going off of some other things, it's like I think class harmony stems from the worker not understanding the spiritual goals of the leader. And right now, right, the leaders don't have a spiritual goal. They just want to line their pockets with profit, right? Ideally, the leader and the creator, like the architect, will work harder than the laborer. But in bourgeois modernity, because they're driven by profits and capital rather than greatness, and because we lack a spiritual goal to orient ourselves, the worker resents the leader, because the leader is more like a ruler or more like a boss who exploits their labor for profit. It's very selfish, because they don't want something more. They don't want something great. They don't want to reach the stars or conquer new lands. They just want money. They just want comfort. They just want pleasure. And that's why there's this bad relationship between the leader and the follower. Something he talks about again, and I want to wrap this up, right? Without a strong industrial base, a country cannot sustain an army or wage war. Thus, it lacks the instrument to exert its will and is weak. And this is important, right? Because essentially what Spengler talks about in the end is how the West is growing weaker because it's starting to forget about the necessity of power and the necessity of technics and the necessity of industry. These are all things that come together to project the power of the state or a people against others, and how the East is rising because they are adopting these technical processes. Modern Faustian man feels disillusioned by the machine and hence seeks spiritualism to detach himself from the machine and avoid becoming a slave to it. So what this means is the spiritual elite are replaced by the bourgeois that views technics and the machine-like organization as purely material. And by abandoning leadership of the machine, the spiritual elite make it beholden to lesser beings, which are the bourgeois, to seize the instruments of power. And this is sort of what happens when the military elite are replaced by the military spiritual elite are replaced by a bourgeois economic merchant elite. And we have to the military must reclaim the power over society at the top of the hierarchy and spiritualize technics once more. Spiritualize technics as a means to a spiritual end. The spiritual end begins with the material and becomes something spiritual through this synchronization of all these great things, like the artist putting the beautiful colors together and painting this beautiful canvas, or technology serving as magic. And he talks about how Western power had a monopoly of industry for such a long time, but it's actually pity that is the downfall of this, and that's what Marxism is. Marxism is this toxic pity of egalitarianism, right? Because a lot of the early Marxists aren't the proletariat, they're bourgeois who pity the proletariat, right? And they give the proletariat a doctrine to weaponize their ressentiment and their envy and their hatred for the master and the well turned out and the beautiful, and they give the weak and the ugly this power. So Spengler says like it was a mistake for the West to share its technical process and technical secrets with the rest of the world. Japan modernizes in 30 years and defeats the Russians in the Sino-Russian War of like 1904, I think. And Russia was, a powerful Western power. I think that's an allusion to what China could do. China could be next. China has an incredibly strong industrial base, the strongest in the world. And we just allowed that to happen by outsourcing our industry to China to produce all these things because it's cheaper. And that's what happens when you're ruled by a merchant elite. You do things for profit rather than power, which is what the military elite would do. The military would prioritize power above all else, but the merchant prioritizes profit and material benefit, and it makes us weaker over time, right? And these rising Eastern powers, as Spengler points out, understand Technics as a spiritual instrument of power, which will lead them to victory. That's what I'm saying we need to do. We need to understand this is a spiritual instrument of power. To meet our spiritual ends, we have to use Technics. And this is a very basic and simple understanding, like coupled with the sort of friend-enemy distinction that Schmidt talks about, which has been forgotten in this sort of toxic liberal pity of the modern West that is making the rising East so dangerous, is they understand the friend-enemy distinction. They understand they must fight for their own preservation. We don't understand that anymore. We want to help everybody and be egalitarian, be altruistic. It's such bullshit, and we have to do something about it. We absolutely do. So these last two quotes are fantastic, and I'm just going to leave you with them. I'm not going to analyze them for you. Because I think you'll understand what they mean, and it's more powerful if I just leave it at that. So I'm going to finish with these beautiful quotes that, again, we're going to be talking about the choice of Achilles again, which I brought up earlier. Faced as we are with this destiny, there is only one world outlook that is worthy of us, that which has already been mentioned as the choice of Achilles. Better a short life, full of deeds and glory, than a long life without content. Already the danger is so great, for every individual, every class, every people, that to cherish any illusion whatever is deplorable. Time does not suffer itself to be halted. There is no question of prudent retreat or wise renunciation. Only dreamers believe there is a way out. Optimism is cowardice. We are born into this time and must bravely follow the path to the destined end. There is no other way. Our duty is to hold on to the last position, without hope, without rescue, like that Roman soldier whose bones were found in front of a door in Pompeii, who during the eruption of Vesuvius died at his post because they forgot to relieve him. That is greatness. That is what it means to be a thoroughbred. The honorable end is the one thing that cannot be taken from a man. So I said I wasn't going to say anything about that, but I take that back, because this sort of sounds like a black pill. This sounds like defeat. This sounds like giving up. And you know what? Maybe Spengler meant that, but I'm not giving up, and you shouldn't give up. And New Rome is not about giving up. He is right. It is better to pick the short life of deeds and glory than the long one that is drawn out and that there is no glory, that there is no greatness, that you just live this mediocre life. And some people need to do that. Some people need to be the follower, right? And that's a good thing. But I know that's not my life. That's not what I'm destined for. And if you're watching this, I can guarantee that's not what you want. That's not what you are destined for. So I say, yes, let us be thoroughbred. Let us fight to the end if that's what it takes. But I truly believe we can win, and we will win. We will win because we have something new and vibrant. We have living fire. We have the living Promethean fire on our side, and that is why we are going to win. So, as always, this is The Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy, and I'll see you next time.